Good morning. Is this coming across loud enough? I just want to say that, again, I really do appreciate being back here. We've got a lot of good friends in the room, and it's every year I meet more people and get to know more about this region, and it's really great. And it's also nice to be here in the Philippines, which is a country I've always enjoyed traveling in. We're going to go through today very rapidly the main thing, and I always say pay attention to these slides. Look at the trend. That's what you're particularly interested in, because anybody that sets up and say we know we're going to be specific numbers down the road, we don't know. Nobody could have anticipated what happened economically in the last 12 months. No one could have anticipated a lot of things. So we're just going to look at trends. This is the driver for the soybean and to a large extent the corn sector worldwide. That's global pork and poultry meat production. As you can see, we're continuing to grow. Had it not been for China, poultry meat probably would have overtaken pork by now. But long-term trend, most likely poultry meat will someday surpass pork. But China consumes so much pork that it is the one that's the big driver of that. I believe it's got 47% of the global pork production is in China. Again, I always try to put this chart up. A lot of the people in here are in the business of either producing, trading, or consuming soybeans and corn. As you can see, those are the two commodities that have had the fastest rate of growth in this since 1990, and that's associated simply with rising per capita incomes around the world, reduced trade barriers, higher per capita incomes, people wanting more meat in their eggs or just animal protein in their diets, and also more vegetable oil. So those things that are driver. Corn is same affected by that, although it's also much more impacted now by ethanol, particularly in the United States. And then we had cotton that was growing all of a sudden. It just collapsed again, and that's because of China not, around the world, people, I think, moving into more casual clothing, not buying as many clothes, and a lot of things, and the demand is not there. And then you have rice, which is steadily growing, but again, slow, and wheat, which is really sort of the dog in the market, because there's no growth in that, because people, as they get more income, tend to eat less bread and eat more meat. Soybean production and consumption on a global basis, as you can see, we had the record before was in 2006 when we had a good crop in the U.S. 2007 we fell back because our farmers shifted more into corn, and that year consumption exceeded production. But this last year, again, we've also, 2008-09, seen consumption exceed production. And as a result, we're getting very low stocks. But now the projections for next year, as you can see, a major rise in production. We're looking like a big crop in the U.S. and with the potential for one in South America. And that, again, will build stocks. Soybean meal consumption, almost sustained growth throughout the period until we got to 2008-09. And then we had a decline because of this last year, simply because of global economic situation and the crop in South America, which was not good. But now we're projecting to recover supplies in the marketplace and see some growth this next year in consumption. U.S. soybean meal consumption, this is one of the more interesting facts about what's happened to soybean meal, is that the two places in the world that have seen the biggest declines in consumption of soybean meal are the two richest parts of the world, U.S. and Europe. I think one of the things that happened in the U.S. is that, number one, we saw a decline in meat exports, which reduced meal demand. We've seen a lot more distillers' grain in the market. It's competing with soy meal, which is reducing demand. But also, one of the things that's occurred, particularly when we'll get to the oil side, is that 20 years ago when we had a recession, most of the Americans were depending on what they call defined benefit retirement plans. Their income was in a pension offered by their employer. We've shifted over the last few years to where now most people are retirement benefits are in fact in tax-free accounts. They've got either what they call IRAs and retirement accounts or whatever that are back, and they don't have the pension protection. So this time, when you saw the stock market fall 40%, everybody looked in their retirement account and went, oh my God, what am I going to retire on? And they went into a savings mode. They just shut down to purchases, and they're into a saving mode. Our politicians have always said we were not saving enough, we need to save more. We did that. It's called a recession. And because we were, in fact, a consumption-driven society. And that's impacted back on demand for meat. It's impacted on demand particularly for vegetable oils. Global soybean oil consumption, again, the same thing. You see a decline this year with a projection of some recovery in the next marketing year. That will be interesting to see if that occurs. I'm not as convinced that the total consumption will grow in the next year, depending on what's going on in the economy. U.S. soybean oil consumption. Here's where we saw a major drop. Two things that contributed to that. One of them was the trans fat labeling, which went into effect January 1, 2007, under which the food manufacturers have to put on the label how much trans fatty acids that are contained in their product. A lot of manufacturers with strong brand names said they didn't want to do that. They didn't want something that was perceived as bad in their food, so they shifted over to using palm, canola, anything else they could get that didn't have to be hydrogenated. And I think second, as part of this fact of Americans reducing their spending, they quit going to restaurants. If you don't go to restaurants and you cook at home, you tend to use less vegetable oil than you would in a restaurant using it. So that's really impacted in the U.S. The perception was that we were going to have this biodiesel sector in the U.S. that was going to just grow and use up all that oil. Well, a problem happened in the process that nobody made any money at it. So now most of the biodiesel that's being produced, as much as possible, they're using animal fats, anything cheap. And they're trying to get away from using the more expensive soybean oil. So in this last year, we saw soybean oil go to record prices, and that really shut down the biodiesel sector because its vegetable oils track the petroleum price. Here's what's happened to palm oil consumption in the United States. All of it just in the last 5 years, we've really expanded consumption. Now, for you that may be involved in the palm oil industry, I can tell you that has got a risky direction, because I think it's just a matter of time till some consumer group comes out and attacks the food companies that are putting palm oil in because of the higher saturated fat content. So I don't know that that'll occur, but I've got a feeling at some point something like the Center for Science and Public Interest is going to come out and go after that. They've done it in the past. They probably will again. Soybean crush rate, we had a record in 2006-07. We cut back some the next year because of a smaller crop in the U.S., and then we really cut back this last year as we saw less demand domestically for meal. Exports were down. Oil stocks were large. We're projecting some increase in this upcoming, or the current marketing years, I guess it is now, but that will depend on, again, exports will drive that, and how much we can actually physically move out of the U.S. will be a factor of how much we crush. Soybean production. This is the big one that's happened. As I said, if you look in 2007, the U.S. really cut back production. And the reason we did was because farmers shifted to corn. But the next year, farmers came back in 2008 and planted a lot more soybeans, and this year they planted even more soybeans. So that this year we're projecting a record crop, and some people are saying 90 million tons or more production in the U.S. Argentina is the one that this year saw the worst drought maybe they've had in 50 to 75 years, and their production was expected to be somewhere around 50, 51 million tons, fell all the way down to 32 million tons. And all of you watching the market know how much impact that's had. Brazil down this last year from 61 to 57. Now, USDA is projecting in the year ahead that we'll go back up to 51 in Argentina, assuming good weather. In Brazil, it's 60. And if the El Nino continues, that speaks favorably to that, because we tend to have more rainfall in South America during an El Nino period. But we'll see. But the situation is that the world stocks are very tight because of what happened in Argentina. Because 95% of what Argentina produces is exported. And if they don't have the crop, where do you get it? This is what's happened on average yields for soybeans, and I think this speaks